Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoria, and sorry I haven't been doing a hell of a lot of videos recently, but I've had a stinking cold, and also many of you will know that I've got an auction coming up at the auction house that I work at, Chiswick Auctions. I'll stick a link below here in case you want to have a look and see what's coming up for sale. In fact, this coming Monday, the 28th of January. We've got some really cool stuff in there, some very nice swords and guns and all sorts of other stuff. But recently on a Facebook page, a question came up about leather liners in Victorian sword hilts. And I'll just quickly show this, but then I'll come back to it a bit later. Here is an example that is a sword that I have coming up for sale, in fact, that is an example which has a leather liner in it. And now, most people aren't used to seeing the leather liners in that type of saber hilt. So if I grab an example here, most people are used to seeing hilts like this, or like that one behind me there, where essentially there's lots of gaps between the bars. Now, some people would point out that those gaps are potential areas where an opposing blade or the point of a bayonet or something like this could come through, and that is true. But we've got to remember that unless you make a perfect sort of orb or sphere around the hand, there are always going to be gaps where an opposing weapon could sort of get you in the hand. And equally, if you make a hilt that is completely encapsulating, that comes with some disadvantages. As George Silver pointed out way back in about 1599, it has some restrictions of getting your hand quickly onto the hilt. Remember, these are backup weapons that often start off in combat in a scabbard, and so you need to quickly access the grip and get the sword out. So you have to have some degree of open hilt so that you can get the hand quickly onto the grip and pull the sword out in the moment of need. But equally, if you made a hilt that was so sort of encapsulating, even on the sides, for example, like a basket hilt but with no gaps, then generally speaking it would be quite heavy as well. And if you didn't make it heavy, then you'd have to make the steel very thin, and then it would dent very easily and stuff like this. So if you want to make a strong guard that is made of thick steel that won't dent very easily and won't like cave in when it gets hit, and you want to make a hilt that you can quickly get your hand onto, it has to be open in certain places. And one of the ways that you can make a very strong guard of reasonably thick steel that isn't overly heavy is to have perforations in it. So if we look at many hilts from across history, whether it's most types of rapier hilts, for example, swept hilts, then they do have openings in them. Partly, not entirely, but partly for this reason, to kind of balance protectiveness with weight. So most of you are used to seeing gaps in the hilt there. Now, that being said, there are ways you can fill those gaps and increase protection without really, or at least not very much, increasing weight. And one of those, I've already given the game away, is a leather liner. Now, anybody who's looked at British basket-hilted swords of the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries will see that particularly in the 18th century, and to some degree in the 17th century, you see leather liners, sometimes fabric liners, inside the basket. So if we look at a Highland basket hilt, for example, even the regimental example that's used today for parade purposes in the Highland regiments, then you will see that they have a liner, usually with a red fabric covering, inside the basket. Now, the original purpose of that liner isn't only for protection in terms of things coming in, it's also to protect your hand from friction against the bars on the inside. So I'm not going to argue that these liners only have one purpose, and that is to protect you from, whether it be cuts or thrusts or anything else coming through the bars of the protective hilt. That is certainly part of it, but additionally, I think it's certainly with the Highland basket hilt, or with the fully the full basket hilt, as we call it, with sides as well as a front, protecting your hand from the basket itself is an element of that, because when you make these basket hilts, in order to have them not be too big and cumbersome and get in the way, they're generally relatively close fitting to the hand. So it's a common flaw in modern replicas of basket hilted swords that the basket hilts are made too massive. Now when you make the basket hilt too massive, you have a lot of rotational inertia. You have the weapon is heavier, for example, because you've just got more metal in it. It's more of a nuisance to wear and all this kind of thing. So for many reasons you want a basket hilt to be relatively close fitting to your hand. But one of the drawbacks to doing that is that your hand is more likely in combat. If the basket hilt, for example, gets hit and dented, it could come into your hand, collide with your hand, or indeed if you're laying about and fighting and your hand comes into any sort of friction or contact with the basket hilt in the context of combat, then it's going to injure your hand to some degree. But if you've got a liner in there or padding, then that's not so much of a problem. We do incidentally also see a parallel if we go to India, thousands of miles away from Scotland, for example. They came to a very similar conclusion with various types of Indian swords. If we look at the so-called Indian basket hilt, which you find on kandars, for example, and also if you look at the gauntlet sword, the pata, those were very often, and equally with Farangi type swords as well, they were often lined or padded on the inside for exactly the same reason. If you have a close fitting encased hilt, you're going to get friction on your bare hand. So rather than necessarily having to wear gloves all the time, you just keep the padding or the liner inside the actual basket hilt itself. So one of the sort of hangovers, as it were, from the Highland basket hilt liner is this. So what this is it's actually a Highland officer's sword. If you notice, it has a broadsword blade on it. So it's a double-edged blade, exactly the same type of blade as you'd find on the Highland officer's broadsword. This is a fairly broad example as well, made by Mole of Birmingham from the 1890s, fairly late 19th century. And this is mounted, as you'll see, on what some of you might call a saber hilt. And it is indeed, yeah, kind of, I mean, technically a saber refers to the blade rather than the hilt, but yes, it is a conventional kind of hilt like we find on lots of 19th century swords. And these in the Highland regiments were designated for what they called field officers, which means you're a major or higher rank. And the reason partly is because they spent most of their time on horseback. And on horseback, it was deemed that this was a more appropriate hilt than the basket hilt. But there is another element to it than that as well. In the Crimean War, a lot of Highland officers actually had non-regulation hilts put on their swords, or just used non-regulation swords, because the swordsmanship that was taught at that time, I think they found that saber hilt was more amenable to the standard kind of regulation practice. There was just a general preference for them. So you do find that basket hilts were sometimes cut down at the sides and made a little bit more into more like saber hilts. But for whatever reason, this pattern of hilt, sometimes known as the cinder regular cavalry pattern hilt, or simply the scroll pattern, in steel rather than brass. So the Royal Engineers from 1857 had the brass version of this guard for their swords. But from about 1855-ish, at least 1860, the steel scroll hilt starts to come in for Highland field officers. Now, that's a divergence from the main point. The main point is Highland regiments, by tradition, had basket-hilted swords with a liner in. And again, if you look back at basket-hilted swords of the 18th century, be they English or Scottish, they do have liners very often. And the Highland regiments had liners in their hilts, and so when they brought in a saber hilt, they kept the liner. And as you'll see, I'll just put the scabbard down for a second. As you'll see, the liner is coloured. Now this is the original sort of over 100-year-old liner, so it's a little bit tatty. But you'll see on the inside it has white patent leather with a blue edging. Originally it would have had a tassel as well, because you'll notice the Highland basket hilts have tassels, so they kept the tassel for the saber hilt. And you'll see through the gaps, hopefully, in the hilt that it is red in there as well. I'm not going to pull it about too much because it's a little bit fragile, this liner. But under there is red, kind of velvet-like material. So you get this really attractive red colour showing through the steel, the gaps in the steel hilt. Now that liner, as I said, is essentially there for three reasons. One, it's there because of tradition, because Highland regiments were, by tradition, had liners in their hilts. So even though this is no longer a basket hilt, they thought, well, we still want it to look like Highlanders, so we're still going to keep liners. They're still going to be red, they're still going to have a tassel. So partly tradition, partly it has an original use in preventing friction to the hand, and partly it adds a degree of protection to things coming through the gaps. Now, the irony is that with this particular guard, as John Latham of the Wilkinson Sword Company himself said, this was just about the best hilt on offer in British sword making business at the time, and really there's no there are very small gaps and very few gaps that a blade could realistically come through in this hilt anyway. But that's not true of all other hilts. So now we come to the original sword that started off the whole question and the discussion. So this is the 1845 pattern infantry officer's sword. Now, usually people are used to seeing these brass hilts without the leather in. Okay, so usually, this is a non-regulation one. This is actually a steel hilt made for an officer who was going to India right at the end of the India Mutiny, and so he decided to have, instead of a brass hilt, a steel hilt. But it's the same design, just made in steel, and then originally this was gilded, so it would have looked similar to the brass one. It would have met regulations, but it's a more protective hilt. But usually people are used to seeing these antique swords with the gaps open. But a surprisingly large number of them were originally actually had leather liners in. And the reason that we know that so many of them did have leather liners are essentially three main reasons. Okay, number one, some of them survive. Okay, so and they're usually in like this, in almost an archaeological condition. The leather is usually very dry, usually quite cracked, usually has bits missing. It doesn't survive well, that type of leather, and they came under fairly regular kind of contact with hand and sweat and stuff like that. Also, if you were on parade, for example, in the rain, then the rain would come down and land on that leather, so it's more liable to damage from weather as well. So some survive. Secondly, they're described in the accounts, in the records, and thirdly, the fact that, quite simply, they are shown in period artwork. You can see them in paintings, in portraits and such like. There is another clue as well, and if you actually look on a lot of these hilts, there are two little holes up here, tiny little pinholes, and there's usually a corresponding, as on this, pair of holes there. It's very difficult for me to show these on camera. It might actually be easier to show you, ironically, on the hilt, which doesn't have a liner anymore, but probably did originally. If we look at the end of the sword, I try and get it to focus just there. Can you see two little holes? There we go. So there's two holes there. And then if we turn the hilt over, and then again try and get it to focus on the hilt instead of my face, you can see two holes there just behind the quillon. And those two holes are securing holes. Now, ironically, whilst a lot of hilts have those securing holes there and there for the leather liner, we do know that the leather liner was not always present, and yet they always had those holes because the guards were made as standard. So sometimes they had those holes. The holes don't always indicate a leather liner. They just indicate that you could have a leather liner if you wanted. And the second irony, or a kind of paradox, is that, for example, on this sword and I've got another example as well in storage at the moment, where the leather liner is present, they're not always secured at those holes. So these leather liners are usually secured in two ways. They're usually glued onto the inside of the guard, and sometimes they're secured through those holes at top and bottom. And they can be secured in three main ways. They can either be secured with stitching through, or they can be secured with a wire through. I've seen both of these. Or, and I've seen this as well, they can be secured through with a tiny rivet, usually made of something like copper. So there are numerous ways of attaching these leather liners. The leather liners weren't always present. If you have those little holes in your hilt, don't think that that definitely guarantees there was a leather liner. It just means there was provision for a leather liner if you wanted it. We know from period accounts and period artwork, photographs and also paintings, that the leather liner was sometimes there, sometimes wasn't there. It was an optional thing. And why did they have it on this sword? Why would you have a leather liner? Well, quite simply, all the evidence that I've seen where they're mentioned and described, it seems to be for a bit of added protection. It could potentially protect your hand from rubbing against the hilt, but that's not really a problem with this style of hilt. I think the main reason that they're there is that these types of hilts were not seen as offering a huge amount of protection to your hand, and if you could add a little a layer of leather on the inside and block those holes, then potentially that could give you some additional protection, which might be useful if someone was trying to take your head off. You know, it's the same reason why going for a steel hilt was an optional extra, and so around the 1850s and 60s, you find officers who were ordering infantry officers' swords if they wanted to purchase a kind of better quality one. They would often go for a steel hilt and then have it gilded instead of having the brass hilt. If you added the leather liner to this as well, you've now got essentially what's like half a basket hilt. You've got a really strong steel guard and you've blocked the holes with a leather liner. I'll finally finish off by saying that whilst here we have looked at infantry swords predominantly, line infantry, and we've been talking about Highland infantry as well, liners are not unique to them. You do find them with cavalry swords. This is actually a sword which is listed on my website at the moment, and this, as you can see, very protective hilt, steel hilt, 1821 pattern guard, 1895 pattern backstrap, resulting in the 1896 pattern cavalry officer's sword. One of the great British sword designs of the era, actually. This is by Wilkinson. It's quite an interesting example. But in this one, for various reasons that we can only guess at, they have put, as you can see, a really nicely made leather and quite thick buff leather liner on the inside. Now, why might they have put that leather liner on there? Well, does it add a bit of protection? Yes, I suppose. If that took a really, really heavy blow from a cutting weapon like a tulwar or something like this, even an axe or something like that, then if the guard did compress in at all, having that thick leather liner is going to add a little bit of extra protection, particularly to kind of almost like impact protection to your hand and protect your hand a bit from the hilt. It might protect a bit from friction between your hand and the hilt additionally, but I think there's another reason as well. So I have various reasons to believe that this sword was made for someone who was going somewhere hot, okay, either South Africa or India or Afghanistan. And if you think about a hilt being worn at your side while you're riding on a horse for hours potentially, during very bright, hot sunlight and all that kind of stuff, everything metal that you're in contact with is going to get really hot to the touch. And I do wonder, because I have read accounts, I know one specific account actually from the mutiny, where an officer says that the hilts of the swords were really hot to touch when you drew them out, because they'd been, they'd had the sun shining on them all day. And I do wonder if possibly that is partly there because of protecting from the heat on your hand. It's just an idea. I don't know that's the reason, but it's a very interesting and relatively rare, actually, example of a custom-made leather liner for a cavalry hilt. They are found, liners for cavalry hilts are found more regularly on the horse guards' swords. So if you look at the life guards, for example, the life guards carry swords which have a white leather buff liner in them. I think that they're largely there for appearance, but there must be originally some theory, some idea why they had a white buff leather liner in there. And possibly it's to protect your gloves from wearing against the inside of the hilt. Possibly it's just for appearances because it looks nice. Possibly it's for added protection. Possibly it's for the heat reason, I don't know. So I'm going to continue researching this topic. I think it's an interesting one. But really just to illuminate people, I think that sometimes when we see a sword which has a bare metal hilt like that, it doesn't mean, especially with British military swords, that they were always that way. Sometimes they had these leather liners inside, and there's nothing to prevent you from equipping your own sword with a leather liner like that for whatever reason you like, either because you like the look of it, or it protects the steel from rust from the sweat from your hands for training purposes, or because it offers extra protection of things coming through the gaps. I know some people who are suggesting doing this with their sparring swords in HEMA, or for whatever other reason, or just simply, you know, like I said, like because it looks good. So there we go. I hope it's been somewhat interesting. Leather liners in Victorian sword hilts of various sorts, and they have, its root really seems to have been in the 17th, 18th century with basket hilted swords, but it carried on into, in this case, the early 20th century, and for parade purposes still today with Highland officers' swords and the lifeguards and Blues and Royals swords as well for parade purposes. Cheers for watching, and I'll see you again soon for another video. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.